First of all, I got to big up Radio Raheem for this interview right here that he did with Eddie Hearn. If you compare Radio Raheem's recent interview on Seconds Out with Eddie Hearn to the recent interviews that Hearn did with Boxing Social and with IFL TV, it's night and day in terms of the way the interviewers approach the interview and the kind of questions they ask. Absolute night and day. Radio Raheem showing how it's done. Now, one of the things I like, and normally when journalists and interviewers do this kind of thing, I don't tend to like it because you see it as kind of a scumbaggy thing to do. But in the case of Eddie Hearn, I actually agree with Radio Raheem's approach here. And what I'm talking about is he kind of rocks Eddie Hearn to sleep in the opening part of the interview, where he tries to bust a little banter. He talks about Eddie Hearn's get up here, where he's dressed like a roadman. But you can't wear a Nike windbreaker and tracky bottoms and then be crossing your legs. It just looks weird, bruv. Right? So sort that out, Eddie. But anyway, he's got a little banter going on with him. And he says something like, the slickness it takes to pull off an outfit like this kind of reminds me of the slickness it takes for Conor Benn. You know, he starts going into the Conor Benn thing, basically. And so Eddie Hearn's thinking he's got banter with the guy, and then Radio Raheem's going for his neck. I appreciate what Radio Raheem did there, because Eddie Hearn has been lying through his teeth about this Conor Benn situation, and he continues to do it in this interview. I mean, a man's got more front than Brighton. Give it a rest, Eddie. So what am I talking about here? Radio Raheem puts it on him with regards to this WBC thing, and Eddie Hearn trying to distract everybody and saying that we want to know what the British Boxing Board of Control and UKAD have to say about the situation. Eddie Hearn comes out, lies through his teeth, and says this has got nothing to do with the British Boxing Board of Control because they were not the ones who were presiding over this thing. I mean, absolute rubbish. He wants people to only focus on the first failed test. That was the one which Conor Benn failed with the clean boxing program WBC. The second failed test, which is the reason the Eubank Junior fight got called off, has nothing to do with the WBC, Eddie. Why are you still trying to make out as though it's got nothing to do with the British board and everything to do with the WBC? It's a lie. Yeah, that's only applicable for the first failed test. With the second failed test, yes, VADA did the testing, but VADA don't investigate anything. So if VADA don't investigate anything, then who can investigate the second failed test? It obviously has to be the British board, and it obviously has to be UKAD. That's why UKAD and the British board have launched an investigation. And that investigation is something that Eddie Hearn and Conor Benn, for whatever reason, do not want to cooperate with. And Eddie Hearn comes out again in the interview, lying through his teeth, saying, oh, it's not about us going the WBC route with their investigation because we don't want to cooperate with the British board, blah, 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 because, you know, it's the easier route to go. No, it's because we only need to do that to clear Conor Benn across the board. That's the inference that he makes. And again, that is just an outright lie. If it's as straightforward as, you know, it doesn't matter who's investigating, they're going to come to the same conclusion, whether it's the British board or WBC, then hand over that dossier, whatever it was, 260 pages, to the British board, just like you handed it over to the WBC. Why is it only the WBC that are being involved in this process and not the British board? And also another thing that Eddie Hearn said in this interview, which is very, very disturbing. And, you know, I've spoken in the past about how how Conor Benn is making himself look bad at every turn with regards to this PED scandal. Eddie Hearn's doing the same thing. Eddie Hearn's making himself look bad. And again, big up Radio Raheem because he asks really excellent questions here. He talks about Conor Benn having to play the bad guy. He then says to Eddie Hearn, because Eddie Hearn is clearly in this interview coming across like a bad guy, like a slimy, lying individual who is just trying to gaslight people. That's how Eddie Hearn comes across in the interview. And so Radio Raheem says to Eddie, are you willing to be the bad guy promoter? Yeah. And Eddie Hearn kind of gets annoyed with the question. But it's a very, very excellent question because that's how you're already coming across Eddie. So either Eddie just isn't that bright when it comes to PR, and that might be the case because Eddie is the kind of guy that likes to talk very often before he thinks. He says things without thinking it through first. He just loves the sound of his own voice, right? So, yeah, with Eddie Hearn, it's like he's making Conor Benn look bad himself, not just Conor. They're both doing a terrible job when it comes to PR. So whether they like it or not, whether they intend to or not, they're already playing the bad guy role, the pair of them. So, yeah, I highly recommend this interview. Radio Raheem shows everybody how it's done in terms of fronting Eddie Hearn and asking him the questions that Eddie doesn't want to be asked. And the only way Eddie seems to be able to respond is just lying through his teeth. And yeah, that was the point I wanted to make, which I nearly came on to earlier on. Eddie Hearn says that it might be a case of if Conor Benn gets cleared by the WBC, he won't bother submitting any information to the British Boxing Board of Control. He did leave that door open, apparently, but he said that it's possible that they'll just, if they get cleared by the WBC, won't engage with the British Board or UCAD. Why? The fans want answers, Eddie. Why would you do that? Why would Conor do that? Give us an explanation. Because if he doesn't give us an explanation, and the only due process we get is this WBC thing, then you have to accept the public turning around and saying Conor Benn is guilty and he's knowingly taken something that he shouldn't have taken. He's going to have to accept that if you don't allow due process to take place with the British Board and UCAD. Never mind the WBC. We know what that's about, Eddie. Yeah, we know what that's about. There's no good reason if you've got nothing to hide, as the old saying goes, there's no reason you can't submit this information. Just like you submitted to the WBC, there's no reason you can't submit it to UCAD and the British Board who are doing their own investigation. So if you don't do that, I think it's fair game for people to start saying, hey, there's something seriously, seriously amiss. And they're already saying that. But you guys know me. I've tried to be as fair as possible. I've tried to be as objective as possible. But every day that Eddie Hearn talks about this or Conor Benn comes out and says something, it just seems to get worse and worse. I'm trying to give every opportunity for these guys to produce some type of evidence, to come out with something that will change the complexion of the whole situation. But instead of doing that, they make it look worse and worse and worse every time they open their mouths. It's the most extraordinary thing. And of course, because some of you guys have been frustrated with me not coming out and going at Eddie Hearn and Conor Benn with regards to the guilt or innocence of Benn, right? I've said all along, or at least for the past couple months, that it would seem at this stage far more likely that Benn is guilty rather than innocent. But in the interest of fairness and objectivity, I've wanted to give him the chance because we haven't seen all the evidence, right? But the longer they carry on like this and keep acting like they're not going to show any evidence at all, oh my gosh. Eventually, I'm going to have to come to the same conclusion as most of you, right? And maybe I've already come to that conclusion privately in my head, right? But if I'm assessing these things publicly, I have to be objective. So that's my take on the situation. Give me your take in the comment section below. If you haven't seen this Radio Raheem interview, it is must watch. I'll leave a link in the description. This is how you're supposed to interview this man, right? Eddie's a guy who likes to be all slick, and some people say smarmy. He's a very charismatic and charming guy. He's a good talker. Yes. Sometimes in order to stop him trying to worm his way out of things, you have to be just as slick as him or more slick than him. And Radio Raheem showed you how to do it. This interview. The setup is, whoa, that setup was, how could I even describe it? It was slick enough for Eddie Hearn to be proud of that setup. I'm sure it caught Eddie Hearn off guard, and Eddie actually gets kind of annoyed with the way that Raheem sets up that first question about Conor Benn. And Raheem's there smiling in his face when he asks him the question. You could tell Eddie's rattled by it. Hilarious. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Are you sick and tired of the mainstream mindset? Does the dogmatic conformity and pathological ignorance have you tearing your hair out in frustration? Then don't be alone. Come and join our brotherhood on Patreon. We stand as a beacon of reason against an army of insanity. You'll gain access to my weekly topical podcast where we take more deep dives than Jacques Cousteau on an endless variety of subjects. There's also videos, interviews, live Q&As, as well as a vast back catalogue of previous episodes, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen via the Patreon app or download in high-quality MP3. Connect with myself and hundreds of other members in our Element chat group. There's no contract, no commitment, you can cancel at any time, and it's cheaper than a Mickey D's McMuffin. Just head to my Patreon page via the link below this video and select the tier called the Brotherhood of Reason. I'll see you over there.